The winter wind cut through Park City, Utah, like a blade in January 1994. Catherine Brennan stood at the edge of Main Street, her auburn hair whipping across her face as she clutched a worn leather satchel against her chest. At 32 years old, she had returned to this mountain town after 15 years away, drawn back by a letter she'd received 3 weeks earlier. A letter with no return address, written in handwriting she hadn't seen since childhood. The streets were quieter than she remembered, the old mining operations long shuttered, leaving behind skeletal structures that dotted the surrounding hills like grave markers. Catherine had grown up here, the daughter of a mine foreman who died in a collapse when she was 17, and she'd sworn never to return. But the letter changed everything. It mentioned her father's name. It mentioned something he'd hidden, and it was signed with initials she recognized. T.M. Thomas Merrick, her father's closest friend, a man who'd vanished without a trace 2 months after her father's death. Before we continue with Catherine's story, if you're enjoying this mystery, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more compelling true stories to light. Catherine checked into the Silver King Lodge, a modest inn that had survived the town's economic decline by catering to the few tourists who came for skiing. The woman at the front desk, somewhere in her 60s with deep-set eyes and silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, studied Catherine's face with unsettling intensity. "You're Frank Brennan's daughter," she said, not as a question but as a statement. Catherine nodded slowly. "I am." "Did you know him?" The woman's expression softened slightly. "Everyone knew Frank, good man, terrible what happened." She slid a key across the counter. "Room 12. You hear about the old mines?" Catherine's throat tightened. "Just visiting," she lied. The woman's knowing look suggested she didn't believe it for a second. That night, Catherine spread the letter across the small desk in her room, reading it for the 100th time. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded in places, but the message remained clear. "Catherine, your father found something in the Angel's Rest shaft 3 days before he died. He told me to keep it secret, to protect you. I failed him. I failed you. If you're reading this, I'm likely gone, but you deserve to know the truth. The map is where we used to meet, under the Angel's wing. Forgive me. T.M." Catherine had spent weeks trying to decipher the reference. The Angel's Rest mine had been closed since 1978, condemned as unstable, but under the Angel's wing meant something else. She remembered the old Catholic church on the east side of town, St. Michael's, where a stone angel stood in the cemetery. Her father and Thomas used to meet there to smoke cigars after their shifts, sitting on the bench beneath the angel statue. The next morning arrived grey and bitter. Catherine drove her rental car through streets slick with ice, past the shuttered storefronts and the few restaurants that still clung to life. St. Michael's Cemetery sat on a hill overlooking the valley, its wrought-iron gates rusted, but still standing. She found the angel easily, a weathered stone figure with outstretched wings, its face eroded by decades of mountain weather. The bench beneath it had rotted away, replaced by nothing but frozen ground. Catherine knelt, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air, and began digging with a small garden trowel she'd brought. 6 inches down, her tool struck something hard. She pulled out a metal box, no larger than a shoebox, sealed with rust and time. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a hand-drawn map of the Angel's Rest mine system, with a section marked in red ink. Beside it was a folded newspaper clipping from February 1979. "Local man missing after mine exploration. Thomas Merrick, 44, last seen near abandoned shaft." Catherine's hands trembled as she studied the map. The marked section showed a tunnel that branched off from the main shaft, leading deeper into the mountain than any official survey indicated. Her father had written notes in the margins, Silver vein, untouched. Company doesn't know. Tommy says we can retire on this. A cold realization settled over her. Her father and Thomas had found an undiscovered silver deposit. They'd kept it secret, and then her father had died in what everyone called an accident. Catherine had always suspected something more, but her mother, overwhelmed by grief and financial ruin, had refused to entertain conspiracy theories. Within a year, her mother had moved them to Denver, desperate to escape the memories. Catherine had built a new life, marketing degree, corporate job, an apartment in Boulder, but the questions had never stopped gnawing at her. She needed to see the mine. She needed to know if Thomas Merrick had gone there looking for the silver, if that's where he'd disappeared. But the Angel's Rest was dangerous, potentially lethal. The Park City Police Department had posted warnings around the entrance, and local ordinances made trespassing a criminal offense. Catherine spent the afternoon at the public library, researching the mine's history. The librarian, a young woman named Jessica, who couldn't have been older than 25, helped her navigate the microfiche archives. "You researching for a book or something?" Jessica asked. "Something like that," Catherine replied. The records showed that Angel's Rest had produced moderate silver yields from 1902 to 1967. Then declining output led to its closure. The fatal collapse that killed her father and 2 other men had occurred in a different mine, the Copper Bell, 3 miles south. But Thomas Merrick's disappearance was connected to Angel's Rest. The newspaper articles from 1979 reported that his truck had been found near the mine entrance, his equipment inside, but no sign of him. Search teams had explored the accessible tunnels, but found nothing. After 2 weeks, the search was called off. He was presumed dead, another victim of the mountain's unforgiving nature. Catherine made a decision that felt both inevitable and insane. She would enter the Angel's Rest. She would follow her father's map. She would find out what happened to Thomas Merrick and maybe, finally, understand why her father had died. She spent 2 days preparing, purchasing climbing equipment, flashlights, rope, and emergency supplies from the outdoor store on Main Street. The clerk, a man in his 50s with a weathered face and suspicious eyes, asked what she was planning. "Hiking," she said simply. "Trails are icy," he warned. "Be careful up there." She assured him she would be. On her 3rd night in Park City, Catherine sat in her hotel room, staring at the map, when someone knocked on her door. She opened it to find a man in his late 60s, tall and lean, with white hair and piercing blue eyes. "Miss Brennan," he said, his voice rough like gravel. "My name is David Kellerman. I worked with your father and Thomas Merrick. I need to talk to you about that map you found." Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs as she stepped back instinctively, her hand still gripping the door handle. David Kellerman stood in the hallway, his weathered face illuminated by the dim fluorescent light, his eyes carrying a weight that spoke of decades of secrets. "How do you know about the map?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. He glanced down the empty corridor, then back at her. "Because I helped draw it. May I come in? This isn't a conversation for hallways." Against her better judgment, Catherine opened the door wider. Kellerman entered slowly, moving like a man whose bones carried the memory of hard labor. He settled into the chair by the window, his gaze drifting to the map spread across the desk before returning to Catherine. "Your father was my friend," Kellerman began, his voice softening. "One of the best men I ever knew. When he and Tommy found that silver vein, they wanted to do it right, file the proper claims, split it fair. But the mine company had different ideas." Catherine sat on the edge of the bed, her mind racing. "What do you mean?" Kellerman's jaw tightened. "Park City Silver Corporation owned the mineral rights to everything in these mountains. Your father discovered that vein on his own time, using his own knowledge, but legally it belonged to the company. Frank knew if he reported it, they'd take everything, give him maybe a small finder's fee. He had you and your mother to think about. He'd worked those mines for 23 years and had nothing to show for it but a bad back and scarred lungs. The story Kellerman told transformed everything Catherine thought she knew. Her father and Thomas had planned to extract small amounts of silver quietly over several months, enough to secure their family's futures without attracting attention. They'd brought Kellerman into their confidence because they needed someone to help navigate the unstable tunnels. For 6 weeks, in late 1978, they'd worked in secret, venturing into Angel's Rest on weekends, pulling out high-grade ore and storing it in a hidden location. They'd accumulated nearly $40,000 worth, a fortune to working men in 1979. Then, 3 days before her father's death, something changed. "Frank came to me scared," Kellerman said, his eyes distant with memory. "Said someone at the company knew. He didn't know who, but someone had been asking questions about the old maps, about abandoned sections of Angel's Rest. He wanted to stop, said it wasn't worth the risk." Tommy disagreed. They argued about it, first time I'd ever seen them fight. Tommy said they were so close, just needed one more haul. Frank refused. Catherine's chest constricted. "And then he died in the Copper Bell collapse." Kellerman nodded slowly. The official report said structural failure, blamed it on water damage weakening the support beams. But Frank was the best mine foreman in the county. He knew those tunnels better than anyone. He would have seen the signs, would have evacuated his crew. The implication hung in the air like smoke. "You think someone caused the collapse?" Catherine whispered. Kellerman's silence was answer enough. "I think your father's death was convenient for someone." 2 weeks after the funeral, Tommy went to Angel's Rest alone. He was convinced there was evidence down there, something that would prove what really happened. I begged him not to go, told him it was too dangerous, but he wouldn't listen. He said he owed it to Frank. Catherine stood, pacing the small room, and he never came back. His truck was found at the entrance, but the police search didn't go deep enough. They checked the main tunnels, declared them empty, and gave up. But Tommy had the map. He knew about the branch tunnel, the one that leads to the vein. If he went down there... Kellerman's voice trailed off. "I'm going into that mine," Catherine said, the words coming out with absolute certainty. Kellerman's eyes widened. "Catherine, no. That's exactly what I came here to prevent. Those tunnels have been deteriorating for 16 years. The risk of collapse, toxic gases, flooding, you wouldn't last an hour." She turned to face him directly. "Thomas Merrick disappeared, looking for the truth about my father's death. For 15 years, I've lived with this hole in my heart, these questions that never got answered. My mother drank herself into an early grave because she couldn't cope with the not knowing. I'm not walking away from this." The determination in her voice seemed to convince Kellerman that argument was futile. He sighed deeply, rubbing his weathered hands together. "If you're going down there, you're not going alone," he said finally. "I know those tunnels better than anyone still living, and I owe it to Frank to make sure his daughter comes back out." They spent the next hour reviewing the map in detail. Kellerman explained the tunnel system, pointing out which sections were likely stable and which would be death traps. The branch tunnel marked in red on her father's map descended at a steep angle, following a natural fault line in the rock. "The air down there will be bad," Kellerman warned. "We'll need respirators, gas detectors, and we can't tell anyone. If the company gets wind of this, or if whoever wanted that silver kept secret is still around, we could end up like Tommy." Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. They agreed to enter the mine before dawn, when the town was still asleep. Kellerman would bring the necessary equipment. He still had access to old mining gear stored in his garage. Catherine would prepare emergency supplies and notify a friend in Boulder to call authorities if she didn't check in by evening. It wasn't much of a safety net, but it was something. As Kellerman stood to leave, he paused at the door. Your father loved you more than anything in this world. Everything he did, every risk he took, was to give you a better life. I want you to know that. Catherine's eyes burned with unsuppressed tears. Thank you for telling me. Dale. After he left, she sat alone in the quiet room. Her father's map spread before her, like a treasure chart, leading to truths she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Sleep came in fragments that night. Catherine dreamed of darkness and confined spaces, of her father's voice calling from somewhere she couldn't reach. She woke at 4:30, her body rigid with anticipation and dread. By 5, she was dressed in layers of thermal clothing, her backpack loaded with water, energy bars, a first aid kit, and 3 backup flashlights. Kellerman picked her up in an old Ford pickup that had seen better decades, its bed loaded with coils of rope, helmets with mounted lamps, respirators, and a canvas bag filled with tools. The drive to Angel's Rest took 20 minutes through pre-dawn darkness, the road climbing steadily into the mountains. The mine entrance was larger than Catherine had imagined, a gaping mouth in the mountainside, surrounded by rusted warning signs and the skeletal remains of old processing equipment. A chain-link fence had once blocked access, but time and vandals had torn sections away, leaving an opening large enough to walk through. Kellerman killed the engine, and they sat in silence for a moment, both understanding that what they were about to do could end in tragedy. Last chance to change your mind, Kellerman said quietly. Catherine opened her door. Let's find out what happened to Thomas Merrick. They entered the mine as the first light of dawn touched the mountain peaks above them. The temperature dropped immediately, the air growing thick and stale. Their helmet lamps cut through absolute darkness, illuminating wooden support beams grey with age and walls slick with moisture. The main tunnel descended at a gentle slope, wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side. Evidence of the police search from 1979 remained, chalk marks on the walls, old rope tied to support beams. They didn't go far, Kellerman observed, maybe 200 yards in, then turned back. He consulted the map, orienting himself by counting cross tunnels. After 10 minutes of careful walking, they reached the branch tunnel marked in red. It was smaller, barely 5 feet high, forcing them to crouch. The support beams here were older, some cracked and sagging under the weight of the mountain above. Kellerman used his gas detector, watching the readings carefully. Carbon dioxide levels are elevated but not critical. We're okay for now, but we need to move fast. They descended deeper, the tunnel growing narrower, the air heavier. Catherine's claustrophobia threatened to overwhelm her, the sensation of millions of tons of rock pressing down, the knowledge that they were moving away from safety with each step. She focused on breathing, on putting one foot in front of the other, on the beam of light that was her only connection to the visible world. After what felt like hours but was probably 30 minutes, they reached a junction where the tunnel split. Kellerman consulted the map again, his brow furrowed. This isn't on the original survey. Frank and Tommy dug this themselves, following the vein. He chose the left path, and they continued. The tunnel began to level out, then opened into a small cavern, roughly 15 feet across. And there, against the far wall, they found the first sign of Thomas Merrick. His mining equipment lay scattered, a pickaxe, a lantern, a canvas bag. Kellerman knelt beside the items, his hand trembling as he picked up the lantern. This is Tommy's. He made it down here. Catherine swept her light across the cavern, looking for any other signs. The walls showed evidence of excavation, marks where ore had been chipped away, piles of rock debris. Her father and Thomas had been working this site, extracting the silver bit by bit. But where was Thomas? There, Kellerman said, his voice barely a whisper. He pointed to another opening in the cavern wall, smaller than the tunnel they'd come through, partially hidden by a rockfall. They approached carefully, moving debris aside. Beyond the opening was another passage, this one descending sharply. Catherine's light caught something on the ground just inside the passage, a piece of fabric, weathered and stained. She picked it up, recognizing it as part of a flannel shirt, the kind miners wore. "He went down there," she said. Kellerman shook his head. "Catherine, that passage looks unstable. The rockfall might have been recent, or it could collapse further at any moment." But Catherine was already moving forward, driven by something beyond rational thought. She needed to know. She needed to find Thomas Merrick and understand what had compelled him to descend into this darkness 15 years ago. The passage was treacherous, the floor sloping at nearly 45 degrees, covered in loose rock that shifted under their weight. They used rope, securing it to stable points, moving inch by inch. Catherine's muscles burned, her lungs working hard in the thin air. The passage seemed endless, a descent into the Earth's core. Then, suddenly, it opened into another chamber, and Catherine's light fell upon something that made her breath catch. A human skeleton, still partially clothed, lay crumpled against the chamber wall. Beside it was a notebook, protected from decay by the dry, cold air. Kellerman crossed himself, his face ashen. "Tommy," he whispered. Catherine approached slowly, her heart breaking for the man who died alone in the darkness, searching for truth. She picked up the notebook with trembling hands, opening it carefully. The entries were dated, starting February 14th, 1979, the day Thomas Merrick had disappeared. She read aloud, her voice echoing in the chamber. "I'm going into Angel's Rest today. If anyone finds this, know that I did this for Frank. He was murdered. I'm certain of it now. I found evidence, a company memo dated 3 days before the Copper Bell collapse. They knew the support beams were compromised. They knew, and they sent Frank and his crew in anyway. Why? Because Frank knew about the Angel's Rest silver, and someone high up wanted him silenced before he could claim it." The next entries chronicled Thomas's descent into the mine, his discovery of the same cavern where Catherine and Kellerman now stood. "I found Frank's excavation site. The vein is massive, exactly like he described. This would have changed everything for our families, but I also found something else. Evidence that someone else has been here recently. Fresh tool marks, new excavation. Someone from the company is already mining this vein, stealing what Frank discovered. I'm going deeper to find proof." The final entry was brief and desperate. "I'm trapped. Rockfall behind me. My lamp is dying. I don't think I'm getting out. Tell Catherine her father was a hero. Tell her he loved her. Tell her the truth." Catherine's tears fell onto the page, blurring the ink. Kellerman stood beside her, his own eyes wet. "He found his proof," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "and he died for it." They searched the chamber thoroughly, finding what Thomas had discovered, a section of wall where recent excavation was evident, newer tool marks cutting into the rock. Someone had been mining this silver, likely for years, using Thomas and Frank's discovery for their own gain. Kellerman took photographs with a camera he'd brought, documenting everything. "We need to take Tommy out of here," he said gently. "Give him a proper burial, and we need to expose what happened." Getting Thomas Merrick's remains back to the surface took 4 hours of exhausting, heartbreaking work. They fashioned a makeshift stretcher from rope and canvas, moving carefully through the unstable passages. By the time they emerged into daylight, Catherine was physically and emotionally spent. They drove directly to the Park City Police Department, where Catherine laid out everything: the letter, the map, the notebook, the photographs. The duty officer, a young man named Martinez, listened with growing disbelief. "Ma'am, these are serious allegations." You're talking about corporate murder, illegal mining operations. This would have involved multiple people. Then investigate, Catherine said firmly. Test the claims. Look at the company records from 1978 and 1979. Follow the money. Someone profited from my father's death and Thomas Merrick's disappearance. Martinez promised to escalate the matter to the county sheriff and the state mining authority. Catherine provided contact information for her attorney in Boulder, insisting that she wanted to be present for any investigation into the Angel's Rest mine. As they left the police station, Kellerman turned to her. You did what you came here to do. You found the truth. Catherine looked up at the mountains, at the town that had taken so much from her family. The truth isn't enough. I want justice. The investigation that followed made regional headlines. Decades-old mining mystery reopened after body discovered, read the Park City Sentinel. State investigators descended on the Angel's Rest mine, bringing structural engineers and forensic accountants. What they uncovered was a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the Park City Silver Corporation. Internal documents revealed that the company had known about Frank Brennan's discovery through an informant, a mid-level manager named Richard Stiles, who'd overheard Frank and Thomas discussing their find in a bar. Rather than confront them legally, executives had decided on a more permanent solution. The copper bell collapse had indeed been engineered, with critical support beams deliberately weakened. Frank Brennan and 2 innocent miners had died to protect corporate theft. Richard Stiles had been the one mining the Angel's Rest silver for years, funneling profits through shell companies. He died in 1989, taking many secrets to his grave, but the paper trail remained. Catherine watched from the courthouse steps as 3 former company executives were led away in handcuffs, charged with conspiracy to commit murder, manslaughter, and fraud. The satisfaction was hollow. Nothing would bring back her father, or Thomas Merrick, or the 2 other miners who died in the Copper Bell. Nothing would return the years her mother had lost to grief and alcohol. But the truth was out, documented, and undeniable. Thomas Merrick was buried in St. Michael's Cemetery beneath the Stone Angel where Catherine had found the map. His sister, whom Catherine had never met, traveled from Oregon to attend the funeral. She was a small woman in her 70s, with the same kind eyes Thomas had in old photographs. "Thank you for bringing my brother home," she said, embracing Catherine. "I never stopped wondering. Now I know he died doing something brave." The Park City community rallied around Catherine, offering apologies for doubts she'd never voiced, expressing admiration for her determination. But she felt disconnected from it all, as if she were watching her life from a distance. David Kellerman became an unexpected friend, the connection to her father she'd always needed. They met for coffee weekly while the legal proceedings dragged on, sharing stories about Frank Brennan that helped Catherine construct a fuller picture of who her father had been. Not just a victim, but a complex man who'd made difficult choices trying to provide for his family. "He would be proud of you," Kellerman told her during one of their meetings. "You're stronger than he ever was." Catherine wasn't sure about that. Strength felt less like an achievement and more like a scar, evidence of damage that had been survived but never fully healed. 6 months after entering the Angel's Rest mine, Catherine stood once more at her father's grave in Denver, where he'd been buried far from the mountains he'd worked. She placed a hand on the simple headstone. "I know what happened now," she said softly. "I know you were trying to take care of us. I know you were a good man caught in an impossible situation, and I know you didn't die by accident." The words felt inadequate, but they were all she had. She'd spent 15 years angry at him for dying, angry at the mines for taking him, angry at the world for being unfair. Now she understood that anger was just grief with nowhere to go. She could finally let both transform into something else, Not forgiveness exactly, but acceptance. Catherine returned to her life in Boulder, but it felt different now, lighter somehow. The questions that had haunted her had answers, even if those answers were painful. She started writing about her experience, crafting an article that was eventually published in a mining industry journal. It detailed the need for stronger oversight, better protections for workers, accountability for corporate malfeasance. The article won a regional journalism award and led to speaking invitations. Catherine found herself becoming an advocate, using her father's story to push for reforms. It gave her purpose, a way to channel the tragedy into something constructive. Thomas Merrick's sister became a close correspondent. The two women bonded by shared loss and hard-won truth. They exchanged letters regularly, finding comfort in their connection. David Kellerman passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 years after the investigation concluded. At his funeral, Catherine delivered a eulogy that celebrated his courage in helping her uncover the truth. "He could have stayed silent," she said to the gathered mourners. "He could have let the past remain buried. But he chose truth over comfort, justice over peace. That's the definition of integrity." She meant every word. In his will, Kellerman left Catherine a small inheritance, $5,000, and a letter. The letter explained that the money represented his share of the silver that had been recovered from Angel's Rest. The state had seized it as evidence, but after the trial concluded, portions were distributed to the families of the victims. Kellerman had wanted Catherine to have his share. "Use it to build something good," he'd written. "That's what Frank would have wanted." Catherine used the money to establish a scholarship fund for the children of miners, focusing on students from Park City and similar mountain communities. The Frank Brennan Memorial Scholarship awarded its first grant in 1997, helping a young woman attend the Colorado School of Mines. Catherine attended the presentation ceremony, watching as the recipient, a girl whose father had died in a mining accident 3 years earlier, accepted the award with tears streaming down her face. In that moment, Catherine felt something shift inside her. The weight she'd carried for so long began to lift. Her father's death hadn't been in vain. Thomas Merrick's sacrifice had led to justice and reform. And now, other families would have opportunities that might prevent similar tragedies. She thought about that winter morning when she'd arrived in Park City, driven by a mysterious letter and unanswered questions. She'd been seeking closure, but what she'd found was something more valuable: purpose. The story didn't have a happy ending in the traditional sense. Her father was still dead. Thomas Merrick was still gone. Years of grief couldn't be undone. But there was meaning in what had happened, a thread of redemption running through the tragedy. Catherine had transformed her pain into action, her loss into legacy. That was its own kind of healing. Standing in the cemetery as the sun set over the mountains, Catherine finally understood what Thomas Merrick had written in his final journal entry. Her father had been a hero, not because he'd found silver or stood up to a corrupt corporation, but because he'd tried to build a better future for his daughter. He'd failed in ways that broke her heart, but he'd succeeded in ways that shaped who she became. She was his legacy, walking and breathing, fighting for truth and justice. And that, Catherine realized, was worth more than any amount of silver hidden in the darkness beneath the earth.